the Bespoke Parenting Hour with Julie Gunlock and Cam Edwards.
Hey, Cam. How are you doing?
I am good, Julie. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm still, sane after both the inauguration and the Women's March here in D.C. So, kind of a tense week up here in Washington.
I was going to say, so I was actually in Las Vegas for the Shooting Hunting Outdoor Trade Show last week.
Lucky you.
And flew, I know, right? Thousands of miles away from all the craziness. And I flew back into Reagan on Saturday night, and I really didn't know what to expect because there had been the big march there that day, and I thought, oh, boy, everything's still going to be a mess. And I had to tell you, it was kind of quiet by the time Saturday night rolled around. I don't know where all the protesters went, but they disappeared.
Yeah, they had to run home to their parents' basements. No, I'm kidding, and I'm going to try to be nice. I was a little bit annoyed. As you know, we were texting each other on, I can't remember, was it inauguration night or the night of the march? I was very emotional.
It was Saturday night.
I was complaining about things and kind of, obviously distressed by some of the things that I was seeing. And since then, I've read some commentary. I thought some very thoughtful commentary. John Podhoretz had a piece in commentary talking about how, we shouldn't dismiss the Women's March and that there might not have been a cohesive message, but, the overwhelming message, and he thought a totally justified message was that women weren't happy with Trump and his language. And that's true, and I will try to recognize that. But one thing that was really interesting is to look at some of the signs and some of the language that these marchers used, and I just found it kind of interesting that these are people who are so concerned about vulgarity and crassness and the use of these really vulgar terms for women's parts, and then these signs displayed the same thing. Now, of course, the counter-argument is that, we hold our presidents to a higher standard, and I agree with that. But it's just, let's face it, it's hatred for Trump's policies. It's not really that he used this, vile language.
I think that's right. And as a matter of fact, I think that if we were talking about, let's say, a President Rubio or a President Cruz or a President Romney, frankly, we would have seen the exact same thing, right?
Exactly.
This is part of the issue for the left right now, is that they can't figure out if Donald Trump is American Hitler or if they want to make fun of conservatives for electing a liberal, right? Some days he's a liberal, some days he's Hitler, some days he's just the epitome of all that is bad about conservatism. They haven't quite figured out how to make him a boogeyman. They just know that he has to be a boogeyman.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. It's almost, I call it, it's like Minority Report. It's like they're mad at him for something he could do, but he hasn't really done anything yet. And, they're sort of condemning him for things that haven't happened. So, yeah, but I want to kind of go back to a lot of people in my neighborhood were bragging about going down to the march. Some people even brought their kids down there. And, I fully believe in engaging your children and bringing your children along to protests. I actually went to a protest once. I'm sorry, I had to sneeze. I went to a protest in front of Greenpeace once. I was protesting Greenpeace's position on GMOs, and I brought my oldest son along because he and I talk a lot about science and GMOs, and he's really interested in genetic modification and technology and science. And so I brought him along, and it was a peaceful protest, and I fully believe in that. However, we all our sign said is we love GMOs. It didn't say some of the. It's pretty tame, but I just want to. I have this list of some of the signs were really funny. One said Donald Trump uses Comic Sans. I thought was pretty hilarious, and others were just more tame. But one said Trump hates kids and puppies for real. Now, to adults, that's kind of funny, but I can imagine one of my kids seeing that and upsetting them. I have another picture of a kid holding a sign that says "Tuck Frump," and then there's an arrow changing the T and the F. You get the point there.
Yeah.
That's not a nice thing. And then there's been coverage of another child holding a really vulgar sign with, some not so nice words. So that to me, I don't think that's an appropriate place for a kid to be. And I don't think it's appropriate for them to see this kind of language. And certainly, see what Madonna said, what Ashley Judd said, and some of the other people up there. I think it was, it was some pretty overwrought people saying some pretty gross things.
Well, in the night before, Friday night, when there were all kinds of damage being done to Washington D.C., there were kids out there then, right?
Yep.
There was,
Right.
at one point there was a crowd of media that had gathered around some people who were setting stuff on fire, and one of the people setting stuff on fire was like this little 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid. Whose parents apparently decided, like, this is how we're going to teach Billy how to, be civically engaged. Come on, Billy, light the match. I that's what I don't get.
And then didn't they interview the kid?
Oh yeah, and he said something about how he wanted to screw the president. That was why he was there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when little Billy starts liking Matt, I can't even talk. Starts enjoying lighting matches too much, they might have a problem on their hands. I mean, that's never a good thing too. I mean, you should be a little bit more self-aware.
Use your words, Billy, not your cleansing fire. I know. I mean, right? This is gonna come back and bite the parents at some point.
Yeah.
I thought this is how we handled our problems, Mom.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable though how I want to go back to something you said that I thought was interesting. You said, it would have been the same had it been McCain or Romney. I think what people forget, or the second term of Bush, Bush too. I think people forget the hysteria during those election seasons. I remember Cameron Diaz going on Oprah Winfrey saying, if Bush is elected again, rape is going to be legal. I mean, come on, right?
Right.
And then. And just my own personal experience. So we live outside of Washington, D.C. in a very nice neighborhood, and we have a large yard. We live in one of those suburbs where the yards are like postage stamps. They have big houses and little yards. Well, we have a little house on in a big yard. So we have this. It's kind of tragic. We're like the littlest house in the town. But anyway, we have this big yard and right on a busy street. And so we often would put political signs out during election years. We put out this enormous, one of those, I guess, 8-foot Romney signs, okay, in our yard. And now let's review, okay? Romney compared to Trump looks like the most moderate guy in the world, right? Just such a good guy, right? And I'm not kidding you. We were verbally assaulted. It was every single day. People would pass our house and scream obscenities to me. I got called the C word. I got called the B word. I got called every name in the book. You effing this, you effing that. Now, Cam, I want to take a moment to also mention and stress that my children were with me when people would scream these obscenities at me, okay? Then, and I was also called, of course, how could I forget, a racist. So I'd explain to the kids what that meant and why we weren't and how Romney is not a racist. It was unbelievable. Now, the sign was also vandalized multiple times. I had a man come to my door, and he was so agitated and upset. I opened the door. I thought he was going to scream at me for the sign. He was so angry that the sign had been torn down and then spent 45 minutes reassembling it in my yard because he said he had just passed the house. He'd seen the sign. He saw that someone had dismantled it. So, I think about that reaction. It's so funny now because you hear liberals saying, oh, Republicans are so awful to have nominated such an awful man. And it's like, okay, but well, we nominated someone who, like, comparatively is, at least what you're suggesting we should have nominated. There was as much vitriol then.
Yes. And, I mean, look, the simple answer is right now, the left tells themselves whatever they have to tell themselves to justify their own bad behavior.
Yeah.
And, so they've all of a sudden now Romney's the elder statesman and, why could you guys have had Romney? And you're exactly right. 4 years ago, In 2012, Romney was just as unacceptable to the left as Donald Trump was. And Mitt Romney had his binders full of women, and he was, going to do all kinds of horrible things to women if he got elected. I mean, this is, so I've been listening a little bit to progressive talk radio. I don't recommend doing this.
Oh, boy.
It's awful. It's just, it's awful. But I've been listening because I want to actually hear what they're saying. I've heard over the past couple of days on Sirius XM's progressive channel that what we need is a new French-style revolution, and we just need to take out the rich. Just, quote, take them out. That wasn't from a host. That was from a caller, but the host had absolutely no criticism of that statement whatsoever.
Right.
And then this morning, actually, right before we started doing this podcast, I'm listening to their morning show, and the host is literally saying, I'm freaking out. I'm so scared. I don't know how I'm going to make it another week. I can't believe I called my dad last night. I said, I don't know how I'm going to make it till Friday. And I'm thinking to myself, like, these are your thought leaders, right? These are the people who are actually supposed to be, leading the conversation right now. And this is what they are expressing. This is what they are allowing their audience to express unchallenged without any pushback. They would have lost their mind no matter who it was, but there is a pretty large contingent of the left right now that really has just decided they have embraced this idea of resistance. They don't even know what the hell they're resisting. They don't know what form it's going to take. They don't know what it means. They just want to wear the beret. They want to smoke their clove cigarettes, and they want to, feel like they're doing something to preserve the republic. And they're not, Julie. All they're doing is having a nationwide temper tantrum. They are freaking out. I mean, I'm looking at this stuff, and I'm looking at this behavior, particularly on Friday night, and the smashing of the windows and the picking up of the bricks and the injuring of police officers. I talked with folks who were there in D.C. who actually had their taxi cabs surrounded by these protesters, and they're rocking the cab back and forth. This couple from Chicago, they really thought that they were, going to be injured. They thought that they were going to flip this car over. So he grabs his wife, and they get out and, have to walk a couple of miles to where they were going. There was another woman I saw who had been egged. She had eggs thrown at her as she was going to an inaugural ball. And she wrote about this. And there was a very nice liberal couple who actually took her in and, into their home, and she was able to clean up and, kind of continue on her way. But she said in her piece, she's like, look, I wasn't a huge Trump voter. I wasn't a huge Trump supporter, but now that he's president, I wanted to go to this ball. And she said, but after, having eggs thrown at me, she's like, yeah, you know what? I'm on his side. I'm not on the side of the people throwing eggs.
Right? What's so interesting, Cam, is there's video yesterday that came out showing some protesters in Portland, Oregon. The police arrive and tackle these protesters and drag them out of the way. So I guess they were blocking traffic or something. And the crowd, there was a huge group of people watching, cheered. Now, when you lose Portlandia, okay,
Portland, right?
you have lost your mind and your message, and you have exhausted any sort of sympathy that you might have gotten for your cause. People are so tired of this. But I will tell you, look, I think there are pockets of that kind of stuff where you're disrupting people's ability to get to work. There's been cases of protesters running out into highways and stopping traffic, and ambulances not being able to get through. I mean, horrifying examples of civil disruption. But, and I think people get tired of that. But I think there is this quiet hysteria. I think liberals in front of their children are unhinged, and, maybe they're not joining a protest, but quietly in their homes, they're having those kinds of conversations. Oh, honey, this is so awful. How are we going to get through the day? And children are hearing this. I mean, I wrote a piece, many, many months ago, right after the election, that in reaction to seeing on my own Facebook feed, parents actually, I'm not kidding, so embarrassing. They were saying things like, I wept in front of my child. And, one woman said, like, I collapsed on my knees and wept, and my kindergarten daughter made me feel better. I mean, just insanity. This is not the way you're supposed to act in front of your kids. I mean, look, I had that. You're going to love this because, Miss free-range mom devotee of Lenore Skenazy. That's myself. Yeah, that was me self-defining. I love Lenore, and I try to be a free-range kid. And occasionally I let my children, walk around the neighborhood, and I lost track of one, and was getting pretty agitated because it was getting dark and I couldn't find him, and it was only a matter of his watch showed the wrong time. He came home right when his watch said it was time, but it was actually off by about 20 minutes, so I was panicking. And I really did. I had a very bad mom moment. I panicked in front of the kids. I started talking to myself, like, where are you? Where are you? Like having this sort of out loud conversation, and I rattled them so badly that by the time we found my son, the other two were crying. Okay, because that was just bad of me. I should have been more self-controlled. I should have kept it together for longer, but I really lost it. Now, take that example and imagine seeing your mom or dad freaking out about the election, saying things like the country is, we're going to go into a civil war. Oh my gosh, we have to we have to resist. We have to join the resistance. This is unsettling to kids. And it teaches them that, there isn't a peaceful transition of power, or maybe there shouldn't be, right?
Right.
And that's a really bad message.
I think it is unsettling for kids, but I also don't think it's happening in a vacuum. I imagine these kids are growing up with parents who are flipping out over everything.
Yeah.
And so this is just the latest flip out. This is the latest freak out, But I imagine during the Obama administration, you had these same parents, every time, especially for the last, 18 months during the election cycle. I imagine these parents were flipping out about everything a Republican candidate said every day. Oh, can you believe, little Billy, you better hope that this doesn't, that Ted Cruz doesn't get elected, or, you're not going to be able to go to college, right? Because you're going to shut down all the colleges. I mean, like, I can, these are the types of parents who are, I don't think this is just an aberration. I think this is probably their norm.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think they probably are teaching their kids to freak out over every little thing. This is one of the reasons why we have these precious snowflakes who can't handle adversity, who can't handle being told, can't handle the slightest bit of criticism,
right.
and
obviously, and then they don't get their way. They don't get their way in the election, and exactly. That's exactly what we're saying. It's funny. Cameron Gray, your producer at Cam and Company, he tweeted something this morning. I don't know if you saw it. It's pretty funny, talking about how his neighbor. It's been days after. It's been almost a week since the Women's March, and his neighbor in where he lives still has up her signs in her window so everyone can see them, including a hand drawing of ovaries that Cameron has to stare at. Okay, and he says, it's a violation of the HOA rules. Now, I'm no fan of HOAs. I think they're tiny little sort of, I don't know. They're just people who like to control other people's property, right? And so
right.
I'm not a big fan of HOAs, but I say turn her in. But that's another, talk about passive aggressive, right? The woman is probably going to have those signs up if she could. I mean, maybe she'll be fined by the HOA if the HOA actually fines her. I can imagine the HOA kind of letting that one go. But I mean, you imagine if this woman didn't have an HOA, or if she did, she probably would have those up for 4 years. It's like that crazy actor who's having that protest. He's
Shia LaBeouf.
What's his name? Shia LaBeouf. That man is a lunatic. But he, for listeners who don't know, Shia LaBeouf, he's this actor he's kind of wacky. I mean, he's done some pretty wacky things. He has a permanent protest going somewhere. Where is it? New York, Cam? I can't remember.
I think it's New York. Yeah.
Yeah. Permanent protest, and he says it's going to be active for 4 years, which is great because then he won't have any time to make any movies. So, he can spare us his presence on the screen. But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing we're going to see. We're going to see these kinds of ridiculous temper tantrums for the next 4 years. I mean, I guess it's amusing. It's frustrating, but if they keep this up, just like Portland, we're not going to see another Democrat in office for decades.
Well, that's the thing, and this is, look, and I say this as somebody, I am a conservative. I do lean right. But at the same time, I would like to have, I think every voter in America really would like to have a real choice when they, go into the ballot box, and to actually get to decide between two candidates. Like, I would love, Julie, to walk in. It's like, who am I going to vote for? I like this person because of this, and I like this person because of that. And we're not seeing that. I mean, we're seeing the absolute decimation of the Democrat Party throughout much of America, where over the last 8 years, they've lost 1,000 seats in state legislatures. They've lost untold numbers of governor's seats. The Democrats are really turning into this sort of coastal enclave party, and then the party of the big mega cities. And frankly, again, when you look at like what happened in Portland, when you're starting to lose these places that are naturally your base because people are getting sick of what they're seeing. Now, look, cheering these protesters doesn't translate into Portlandians voting Republican in 2018.
Right.
But it also does make it a little bit harder for them to vote Democrat, I'd say.
I agree.
Do I really want to reward these people? And these conversations, I mean, if you look at where these protests have taken place, I mentioned this on Twitter last night, they keep protesting the places where they didn't vote for Donald Trump. Right. And I don't know if this is laziness on their part or if they're actually afraid to go out and protest places that did vote for Donald Trump. But it's Washington, D.C. I'm sure the 36 Democrats who live in Washington, or the 3 Republicans who live in Washington, D.C. were really, really cheesed that they, their Starbucks got broken into. Protesting in Austin, Texas, protesting in Portland, Oregon. Right. They're not protesting in Farmville. Julie.
Right.
I'll tell you that. We have not seen any big demonstrations in Farmville, and I would imagine that's because Democrats and Republicans alike wouldn't put up with that if they decided to come down here and trash our town.
I don't know if it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, but it was a fascinating article about where a reporter went out into sort of rural communities and interviewed women if they knew about the Women's March. And, I mean, the lead paragraph is him saying to this young woman, hey, did you hear about what's going on in Washington, this Women's March? And she shrugged. I mean, this is the very first paragraph. Shrugged her shoulders and says, I don't know nothing about it, right? And it was and then he goes on and interviews more and more women, and some women said, yeah, I've heard of it, but I don't have time for that because, they have real things to do. I mean, let's also keep in mind, right, that this was the ultimate privileged white woman's march. I mean, they have this picture of JetBlue or Southwest or someone turning the stupid plane pink, and which I love. Like, feminists reject the color pink for everything, but then they all are donning these pink pussy hats. I cannot believe I just said that. But yes, they're all, it's like pink is all over now when you normally get, feminist outraged if, Legos makes a pink, Lego kid or a pink Nerf gun or something. They get all angry about it. But anyway, fine. So, they show this plane. I'm on a tangent. They show this plane and, it's like a plane filled with what looks like pretty, well-off white women. And so, think about that. That's a flight. That is a 1 day. I'm going to St. Louis tomorrow for a work trip. And I'm going back and forth. And that ticket cost me $450 to go back and forth to St. Louis in 1 day. Okay. That's not cheap. Okay. So, and then they had, and maybe some women stayed overnight. Well, fine. Then you have to add on, that flights aren't cheap to Washington from some of these areas. And then you have to add on a hotel. In the Washington, D.C. area, that's expensive. And so, let's not act like this is, some bringing together of, it's not a melting pot of women. Okay. It was a very privileged group of women who were able to march on Washington. And again,
it was a very specific ideology that was welcome.
Yep.
Right. I mean, if you were pro-life, if you were pro-gun, probably not. We've got the Moms Band Action, folks who are coming up. So if you were a certain type of woman, if you were a Hillary Clinton supporter, if you were a progressive, and that's the other thing, it sort of morphed into, I think, towards the end, this just sort of catch-all for, go out and protest, right?
Yeah,
so if you're just on the left, right? So I think, going forward, I mean, this is nominally the Bespoke Parenting Hour, so maybe we should talk about, how we teach our kids, what we teach our kids about this stuff. But I mean, you're surrounded by this, as you talk about it. You're living in the middle of this, and
it's hard.
what are you going to tell your kids going forward? Because I don't imagine, by the way, that there's going to be any return to sanity anytime soon.
Well,
are you afraid that this is going to now trickle out and trickle down into the schools? Are we going to have...
it already has. It absolutely already has. We had multiple conversations, and what disgusts me is the distortions of, for instance, the immigration issue. Trump has said publicly that he wants to deport some immigrants, illegal aliens. He wants to deport those that are felons, that have committed crimes, have come into this country and committed crimes. Why anybody would object to that is beyond me, but some people are distorting that and saying Trump wants to deport all people here, undocumented, right? They call them undocumented immigrants, right? They don't mention that he wants to only deport the ones with violent criminal histories or felonies. And so that distorts it. So what my children come home with is, and I'm not kidding you, some of those kids, and this is parroting from their parents, we're saying that certain kids of Hispanic origin were going to be deported. And there were kids that were very upset about it at school because they knew that they were being talked about, and they knew that they had this idea, and then other kids were upset that their friends were going to... I mean, that is so awful to say that, and then to say it in a way, in an alarming enough way that a child understands it, is just so reprehensible. So I had to explain to my kids that no, Donald Trump, but this is the interesting thing. I also had a conversation about how people have different opinions about immigration. And I explained, that, look, the basis of America, immigration is very important to America's history and it's our origins, and we need to welcome immigration, but there is a legal process. And I explained the legal process in France and the legal process in nearly every other country that has a process by which you have to follow to come into our country. And so I said, we can't just move to another country and start working. There's a process for immigration. And so, I had a very thoughtful conversation with them and arming them with the information so that they can really identify when someone's kind of being hysterical. But, that's the thing that nobody talks about, is that you are really harming. There are an awful lot of, probably children of illegal immigrants in our public school systems who are hearing some terrible stuff and lies. And liberals don't care. They don't care that they're harming those kids with that false information if it furthers their agenda, which is to distort Donald Trump, to make him look like a bad guy and to make him look like a monster. They don't care what they're doing to these other children, because ultimately the aim is to harm Donald Trump.
Yes, and I also think too and I've just seen this with the anti-gun movement. They are so dependent, actually, on provoking that emotional reaction and letting emotions drive their activism. This is, one of the reasons why anti-gun activists are told when there's like a high-profile shooting incident, start talking, right? Go on social media and start talking. Don't get specific. Just start talking about, vague need for gun control and bash the NRA and do all of these things. Try to make that emotional connection with your audience. And so I think they're doing that on a exponentially larger basis right now, where they want Democrats to be amped up. They want people on the left to be freaked out because they think that translates into electoral action. And I'm not sure that I frankly think it's a horrible way to go about trying to produce victories for your cause by trying to yank people's emotional heartstrings. I don't think it's actually going to translate into electoral victories for Democrats, because again, what they're doing is they're making people freak out. They're making their base freak out. And there are a lot of Americans who are willing to give Donald Trump a chance. They are not blind devotees of President Trump any more than they were blind devotees of President Obama, but they're willing to give him a chance. He said that he was going to shake things up, and frankly, there are a lot of Americans who want to see D.C. shaken up. They don't have a problem with a hiring freeze of federal employees. They don't have a problem with saying we're actually going to enforce the immigration laws that are on the books and have not been enforced. They actually approve of these things, and they want to see how this plays out. The left can't afford that to happen. And so, they've got to get everybody thinking that the internment camps are going to be set up next week, and we're going to the federal government's going to shut down the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed, and I don't know. First of all, I don't know how you sustain that for 4 years.
I don't know.
And it'll be interesting to see how they try. But I suspect it'll be more like this 2-year campaign. The midterm elections will happen. The Democrats will not get the numbers that they need to take back either the House or the Senate. And then hopefully they will actually take a deep breath and say, okay, that didn't work. Maybe we try being grown-ups for a little bit. But I don't see it happen anytime soon. And again, I think there's an untold amount of damage that can be done to their own cause as well as to the country over the next couple of years by how they're acting and freaking out.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I will tell you, it is very difficult living in this particular community because it is freak out central. Like I had mentioned, your producer, Cameron Gray, in his tweet, he lives in what I call Smug Central, another part of the town that I live in. And so it is very difficult. And again, I do worry so much for kids that are growing up with this kind of narrative that, such an embrace of civil disobedience for before anything bad even happens, before any policies have even really been put in place. I mean, he's signed a few executive orders that, but they're nothing new. I mean, these are the kind of executive orders that every Republican president and maybe even some Democrats, if we ever got some reasonable ones, probably would have done. So it's really disturbing. I think it's an incredibly bad lesson to be teaching our children. I think that we are doing more to ingrain the snowflake culture in our greater American culture. We are no longer sort of, tough, go-get-em Americans that are resilient and courageous. We are increasingly weakening our population base, and it's very, very disturbing. And it's, as a mother of 3 boys, I hope to raise strong men, courageous men, and it's really important to keep them separate from that culture. It makes parenting very difficult.
It does. Now, I will give you, I think, a little bit of optimism. Maybe we can end on an optimistic note, because while that is playing out in the dominant culture, and I think, I call it the dominant culture because I think the left does dominate the pop culture. But I also think within that sort of counterculture, we are starting to see a resurgence of people who can actually be role models for you, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
Mike Rowe is he doesn't have he doesn't have dirty jobs anymore. I think right now he's focusing on his new podcast, but he is still hugely popular and hugely influential among his audience, and it's because it's not that Mike Rowe is a fire-breathing conservative who's always out there bashing Republicans. He really doesn't get political at all. Right. But what he talks about and what he promotes and what he highlights are those men and women who have a solid work ethic, who aren't afraid to do jobs that other people would turn their heads at, right? Yep. And I think that there are those role models out there, and I think we're going to see more and more of those role models. Within this administration, I think you're going to see more and more of those folks highlighted, but I think you're also going to see, I hope you're going to see the counterculture start to promote these men and women as, look, you don't have to be a snowflake. Look, you don't have to be the celebrity who freaks out about every little thing. You can be this firefighter. You can be this cop. You can be this soldier. You can be this guy this plumber, this electrician, and to actually, offer up alternatives to these folks who are freaking out. I hope and I think that we will see more of those individuals highlighted over the next 4 years. And we have to do that, I think, as well as a movement. We have to actively seek to promote and to celebrate those anti-snowflakes when we see them.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. Well, hopefully I will be able to do that with my sons. Raise good men. I mean, seriously, there's no better model than Mike Rowe. I'm very lucky that I am married to a Mike Rowe type, a solid, courageous, tough guy who doesn't really suffer fools or kind of silliness on the grand scale that we saw in Washington. this week. So I'm lucky in that way. And I know you are the same. I think this would be a good time. Can you just mention your book?
Oh, sure. I can mention the book, Heavy Lifting, Grow Up, Get a Job, Start a Family, and Other Manly Advice that I co-wrote with Jim Garrity of National Review. Came out late 2015. So it's a little more than a year old. It's still available. And it is. If you've got anybody who you're concerned about, becoming a snowflake, it's a great book for, kids who are just getting ready to graduate high school, or young adults who are just graduating college. And it basically is a celebration of, why we shouldn't want to extend our adolescence out until we're 40 years old, why it's good to grow up, why it's better to be an adult, frankly, than it is to be a shrieking snowflake. And thank you.
It's also
for
funny. It is funny. It is funny as hell. And I actually wrote a review for it. I think one of the best reviews you got, frankly. And my point was that it was because, everybody was saying, oh, this is a great book for, dads and young men. And da-da. And my point was, I thought it was a great book for women, for young women who are in the dating scene right now. I was saying, this needs to be your model for a husband. These guys that you are talking about, your model is Ward Cleaver. It's very. I loved how you integrated Ward Cleaver sort of analogies into the book. This is who you should be looking for. These types of men. These men are great partners. They help you. They help take care of because they're not the type of guy who, like, when you go out with your girlfriends, they think they're babysitting. I mean, they're watching their own kids, right? I mean, these are good guys who accept responsibility, who like having responsibility, who enjoy time with their families, who see the benefits of having a strong family and raising good people. So my advice was it being almost like a dating guide for girls, which I know was a slightly different take, and maybe not your intended audience, but that was sort of my takeaway from it. So. Well, listen, Cam, I'm glad you got to plug your book. I think we should actually probably dedicate a bespoke parenting hour to your book and more fully discuss it because it really was a great book, and I'd like to fully explore it, especially as the parent of three boys. I think it's really important that people have that perspective. So I'm so glad we talked today. I feel a little bit better
Me
about
too.
March.
I know.
And,
I know. I'm sorry we had to miss last week, but hopefully, I think now we're kind of both on a little bit more regular schedule. So
yes, I think so. And thank you for dealing with my emotional tweets and messages that night of the march. Both you and my husband were very annoyed with me. So I'm feeling better now, and this has been very therapeutic for me to talk this through. So all right. So I guess we will talk
I'm here
next
for you
week.
whenever. All right, have fun in St. Louis.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to another edition of the Bespoke Parenting Hour.